മാധ്യമങ്ങൾ വാർത്തയാകുമ്പോൾ എന്ന വിഷയത്തിലുള്ള പ്രൊഫസർ മുരളീധരൻ സ്മാരക പ്രഭാഷണമാണ് അടുത്തത്. ദൃശ്യമാധ്യമ രംഗത്തെ ശ്രദ്ധേയ സാന്നിധ്യം, പത്രപ്രവർത്തകൻ, ചലച്ചിത്ര നിർമ്മാതാവ്, സംവിധായകൻ, നടൻ എന്നീ നിലകളിൽ വിശിഷ്ട സംഭാവനകൾ സമർപ്പിച്ചിട്ടുള്ള ശ്രീ ശശികുമാർ സാറിനെ ഏറെ ആദരവോടെ ക്ഷണിക്കുകയാണ്.
ഇന്നത്തെ അധ്യക്ഷൻ ഡോക്ടർ ബാലകൃഷ്ണൻ, വേദിയിലും സദസ്സിലുമുള്ള വിശിഷ്ട വ്യക്തികളെ, അതിഥികളെ, ആദ്യം തന്നെ ഞാൻ ഒരു മുൻകൂർ ജാമ്യം എന്നുള്ള രീതിയിൽ ഈ പ്രഭാഷണം എന്നതിന് വിശേഷിപ്പിക്കാൻ പറ്റുമെന്ന് അറിയില്ല. ഞാൻ കഴിയുന്നതും ഇംഗ്ലീഷിലായിരിക്കും പറയുന്നത്. കാരണം രണ്ടാണ്. ഒന്ന്, ഒരു മെമ്മോറിയൽ അഡ്രസ്സ് നിർവഹിക്കാനുള്ള മലയാളം കൈവശമില്ല എന്ന് എനിക്ക് ബോധ്യമുള്ളതുകൊണ്ടും, കാരണം ഞാൻ മലയാളം പഠിച്ചിട്ടില്ല. സത്യം പറഞ്ഞാൽ ഞാൻ കേരളത്തിൽ പഠിച്ചിട്ടില്ല, മലയാളം ഒരു ഭാഷയായി പഠിച്ചിട്ടില്ല. വീട്ടിൽ അമ്മ ഒരുപാട് തല്ലി പഠിപ്പിച്ചൊരു ഭാഷയാണ് മലയാളം. അതിൻ്റെ ഗുണം എനിക്കിപ്പോൾ അനുഭവിക്കുന്നുണ്ട്. എന്നാലും ഇതിൻ്റെ ഭാരവാഹികൾ ഞാൻ സംസാരിച്ചപ്പോൾ ഇംഗ്ലീഷിൽ സംസാരിച്ചാലും പ്രശ്നമില്ല എന്ന് പറഞ്ഞു. അതുകൊണ്ട് ഞാൻ ആദ്യം അത് പറഞ്ഞുകൊള്ളട്ടെ. ഇന്ന് നമ്മൾ ഓർക്കുന്ന, അല്ലെങ്കിൽ ദ പേഴ്സൺ വി ആർ റിമെമ്പറിങ് ടുഡേ, ഡോക്ടർ മുരളീധരൻ അല്ലെങ്കിൽ മുരളി മാഷ് എന്ന് അറിയപ്പെടുന്ന അദ്ദേഹത്തെ പറ്റി ഞാൻ വായിച്ചും കേട്ടും മനസ്സിലാക്കുന്നതാണ്. I have not met him, or if I have, I don't really remember having interacted with him. But I had the fortune of going through some of the articles in this book. അരികിൽ നീ ഉണ്ടായിരുന്നെങ്കിൽ. And that provides a fair measure of the man. That provides the Marxist praxis of intellectual rigor and its organic application in your life. This is very rare. I think it was Bernard Shaw, if I'm not mistaken, who said, "Those who can do, those who can't teach." But here you have someone who could both do and teach. That is a rare combination. It was always a rare combination. It's even more so in this day and age, where, as was mentioned by the chairperson of the awards committee, scoring academic brownie points or degrees or doctoral or postdoctoral degrees, not in all cases, but in many cases, has become routine, ritual, meaningless, and superficial. Therefore, on that count alone, if a teacher of English, who is an accomplished teacher of English, a professor of English, must also win the hearts of not just his students over generations, over decades, but also of the society he lives in, if he must become an exemplar, if he must become an example for the society he lives in and moves in, if he must hold fast to steadfast values, human values, secular values, progressive values, values which are the necessary, essential values of the left, I believe, it is small wonder that he is remembered by a rich audience like this, a rich forum like this. I am to speak on the theme of the identity crisis of the media today. I call it an identity crisis because the media, the news media that we experience today, that we are beneficiaries or victims of today, whichever way you look at it, is going through a severe identity crisis. And that identity crisis affects civil society, it affects the public sphere, it affects our democracy. Because if you must say democracy in one breath, you must be able to say a free media in the next breath. Otherwise, that democracy is a sham. Democracy is not about elections and coming to power. Hitler came to power, elected to power. Mussolini was elected to power. Franco was elected to power. There are authoritarian figures, dictators, who have been elected to power across the world. They continue to be elected to power. Democracy is not about rule of law alone. But of course, rule of law is important, but the law is above everybody else. Democracy destroyed the idea that I am the state. King Louis XIV in France declared, I am the state. And his successor, Louis XV, said, after me the deluge. There was no concept of separation of powers then. It is with Montesquieu that you have the idea of separation of powers and the idea of a state, of the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, as we understand it, and the fourth pillar of democracy, the press, which characterizes separation of powers, a constitutional mechanism and scheme of separation of powers, which recognizes and celebrates a democracy and a republic, came to be. It is a free media that really qualifies. It's a sine qua non. It is what defines a democracy. So if you must say democracy in one breath and you are not able to say a free media in the next breath, that democracy is a sham. It is not what we are seeing today in India is again an appropriation of the separation of powers concept. It's a sabotage, it's a subversion. You do have the executive, the legislature, the judiciary, I think, continues to be independent by and large, not all of it. The executive and the legislature are already looking the same. If all bills can be passed as money bill, you don't need a legislature. You don't need a discussion in parliament. If you have a majoritarian parliament, there's no scope for discussion and debate and pros and cons of an issue. If majoritarianism is to be the rule on everything, you don't need protections of a constitution. You find all of these challenges before us. And the fourth pillar of democracy, the free media, has unfortunately either abnegated, either surrendered its role or capitulated before the executive of the day. Of course, we compare what we are going through today with the 1970s, when there was a formal emergency, mid-1970s. I was a student in college then. 1975, 77. Those years were very crucial. That was a dark chapter in India's history. I remember as a student in Madras Christian College then, affiliated with the SFI and so on. Before the emergency, we were worried about the monopoly press, what we call the bourgeois press in the country. We have sloganeered, shouted slogans against Ramnath Goenka and the Indian Express because we called it the jute press. We called it the monopoly jute press. And when the emergency came, the only man with a spine in the media who stood against Mrs. Gandhi's excesses was this jute press. That doesn't change the character of bourgeois media. But it shows you that the press, as a fourth pillar of democracy, much bigger newspapers, much bigger media organizations surrendered, capitulated, laid themselves supine before the powers that be. As Advani famously said, when they were asked to bend, they crawled. Today we have, I have no doubt about it, we may not have a formal emergency, we may not have a declared emergency, but we have all the characteristics, all the symptoms of a silent, undeclared emergency, which has taken the media by storm to begin with. This was bound to happen. The media today is not able to stand up to those in power because it has lost its essential characteristic of being a fourth pillar of democracy. Which is why India is not called a democracy by those who audit democracy internationally. It's called an elected autocracy. It's called a lesser democracy. In the World Press Freedom Index, which is done by the very reputed Reporters Sans Frontiers every year, in 2022, India's position, ranking, is 150th in a list of 180. 150 out of 180. There are only 30 countries below us, or less than that, 29 countries. Most of them dictatorships, banana republics, which don't have a semblance of democracy you can speak about. We are in the company of that. It's a club of shame that we are part of. So this is the nature of democracy and the way the media has deteriorated. We spoke about the role of a teacher in society, the role of a professor in society, academics. Academics in the sense of praxis, academics who are not just ivory tower people who sit in campuses and think about deep research, which is also important in science and so on, technology and so on. But academics who have a sense of the other, who have a sense of society beyond the campus. And we now remember how prescient many scholars, many philosophers were when they warned academics against the temptation of the media. Noam Chomsky, Derrida, Edward Said, all of them have written eloquently about why academics should be wary, should be careful about the temptation of the media. Because the media of a particular kind appropriates academics. The famous scholar Pierre Bourdieu, who was the chairperson of the Collège de France, one of the best philosophers of our generation, of this 20th century certainly, if not the 21st century. He passed away some years back. He called this heteronomy. He said, when academics begin to cultivate the media, it dilutes academics and you make media manufactured academia. He said, a good historian is a good historian because another historian says he is a good historian. Not because he comes on primetime television 5 days a week and speaks 30 seconds each time about history. That's called peer recognition. In science, you still have that. You have peer review of scientific articles and journals. And unless a journal, an article, a proposition, a thesis is peer reviewed, it's not worth the paper it's written on. It's peer reviewed and endorsed. But today, it's the media. It's a media dictated, media manufactured society. Even in the realm of academics. I'm mentioning that because This is a forum of academia. We are speaking about a professor. And many of you are accomplished academics yourselves. How did this media, which played such an important role in the struggle for India's independence, in the run-up for independence, in the struggle for independence, every freedom fighter worth the salt, or at least most of them, was either a lawyer or a journalist or both. Gandhi is a very good example of that combination. At any time, he was editing 5 journals at a time. On train journeys, he was editing and sending it through telegraphic messages for proofed messages to be printed, proofed articles to be printed, and so on. In his Indian opinion, in fact, it is his relationship, it is his function as a journalist that brings him the idea of satyagraha. As he writes in Indian opinion, he said it is in my writing, as he writes in his autobiography, he says, it's in my writing of the Indian opinion, as editing the Indian opinion, that I had this soliloquy, I had this dialogue with myself through the pages of what I wrote. It's a process of self-awareness and refinement, and the concept of satyagraha as a unique weapon with which he fought the independence of India emerged. So the media, the role of the media has been decisive, has been vital, has been crucial in the emergence of independent India. It is that media now which is suffering an identity crisis. And the media is something that emerges with struggle in every society. Even the idea of media, the idea of news media or journalism, it's not very old, it's about 400 years old. In the 17th century, in Tudor England, because of the development of capitalism, because of the fact that the Gutenberg press has emerged, the Caxton press has emerged, because of the Reformation, the Puritan Reformation process, there was a widespread reach for reading the Bible, for instance. Literacy suddenly flourished. And people began to ask questions. The media emerges in a particular context. And there was struggle after struggle after struggle after struggle. And many of those lessons are relevant to us even today. Under Henry VIII in Tudor England, there was a concept called scandalum magnatum. In other words, you do not scandalize the magnates of the land. You do not write anything which is irreverent or scandalizes the lords, the aristocracy, the patricians, not the plebeians. And if you do, you are charged with libel. And the idea that you could say even something truthfully about someone was not tolerated. In fact, the saying was, suppose you said, I have written this about this man because what I have written is true and I have evidence to prove that. If you said that, you get into more trouble. Because the greater the truth, the greater the libel. The greater the truth, the greater the defamation. That was the slogan. That was the theme. Today we have echoes of that. If you wrote, if you drew a caricature, if you drew a cartoon, if you spoke against A, B, or C, and we know who A, B, or C may be, you are arbitrarily hauled up. You are charged for no less than anti-state activity, for sedition, or UAPA, or the forces at the mercy of the state. The agencies of the state are unleashed on you, whether it is the Enforcement Directorate or the CBI or any of those other agencies. So that struggle with which the media came into being was undone at a particular context of our history, not too far back, in the 1990s, 1991, 92, when, as you know, liberalization and globalization hit us. It hit the world before us, and we followed it, mindlessly, blindly followed it. Because the media went through a paradigm shift then. A media whose primary concern was speaking truth to power, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable, comforting the afflicted and afflicting the comfortable. A media which believed in investigative rigor, in verification, in exposing the injustices, the iniquities around us, shifted track and became concerned just with profit. Because that is the essence of globalization and liberalization. The media became a market model. This is not to suggest that the media had no market model before that. Of course, a media has to make profit in order to be sustainable. In fact, if you don't have a healthy bottom line, you can't even be bold. You can't speak truth to power. If you're worried about paying salaries to your staff the next month, you won't have the wherewithal, the intellectual equipment, or the guts to speak truth to power. But there's a difference between making profit and profiteering. That shift took place, and it became a pure market model. And market model with all the elements of that market model. Of course, we were following the American example, because in America, the media has always been a market model. It's traced back to that famous tract by John Milton called Areopagitica, somewhere in 17th century, which says, whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter, meaning it is through discussion and debate and disagreement and intellectual fireworks that truth emerges. And that creates the environment for media. And that creates competition. And in that competition, you'll get differentiation of opinion. You get a pluralist society. You get plural views. This is called the self-righting principle in the American context, that whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. This automatically adjusts itself, and you'll find an equitable media sphere. And the famous judge of the Supreme Court, Oliver Wendell Holmes, who's cited even today in landmark decisions, not just in the US but across the world, took this to coin the term, America is a marketplace of ideas. In other words, ideas are also like a marketplace. Free, fair competition, and ideas will flourish. There'll be more ideas, there'll be more choice, there'll be greater variety, which is the essence of democracy. We were getting into that realm in the 1990s. This happened in the United States way back in the 19th century and early 20th century. And in the United States, they had checks and balances for that. They have what's called cross-media restrictions. You could not have monopoly press emerging in the US, actually. Recently, these restrictions have been diluted, but even now. It's called the New York Times because they were given a franchise where they could circulate so much in New York, but only less in the rest of the United States. You had geographical controls. You had ceilings on which you can grow in a particular area. If I'm a press baron, I could not also do television and radio and online. So there were cross-media restrictions which were meant to avoid monopolies emerging, oligopolies emerging, cartels emerging. In India, we didn't have anything like that. In India, on the contrary, we had no rules. We had not framed rules for the media. I was able to think of an idea like Asianet because there were no such rules. The only rule prevalent then was the Indian Telegraph Act of 1885, an old colonial rule, which spoke about the state having the powers. Only the state can uplink signals, radio signals from Indian territory, but was silent about who could receive and distribute them because they had not envisaged that possibility. That was not something they thought would happen. And so we went to Singapore, we went to Initially, Dubna, Earth station near Russia, Moscow in those days. And then later before that we went to Singapore. We went to the Philippines, where there was an American military station. And uplink from there, we had people reading news from there. Many of the people you see on television today, whether it's Nikesh or Pramod or Neelan, I mean, many of them were stationed in those places. And they were reading news from there. We would send copy from here by teleprinters. The internet and computer hadn't just arrived, hadn't yet arrived. So there was no media rule, there was no framework of rules. And then as a fait accompli, that is a fait accompli, to correct that fait accompli, they brought in the Cable and Television Act. Satellite and Cable TV Act, as you know. And since 2014, there have been more and more rigorous. Now we are in over-regulated media space. We have the recent rules for electronic media, where it's astounding. If I'm running a portal and something there is not palatable, or somebody finds fault with something written there or shown there, he or she can send a complaint to us. We are supposed to have a complaint officer. And if the complaint officer does not tackle that complaint well enough, that person can appeal. It then goes to the body of those professionals. If there's a television body association or a digital media body in each place, it goes to that body. And if that body tackles that issue and the complainant is still not satisfied, it then goes to an appellate jurisdiction comprising bureaucrats in the government, headed by a joint secretary. And if you're not happy with that, it goes to the next appellate authority, which is headed by the secretary. That's the only difference. In other words, government is the last word on what freedom of the media is. The media hasn't even raised an uproar about this. There have been editorials in the Hindu and a few newspapers. I don't know how many of you even know about this. Because the media is scared to even speak about how they are being attacked. Because that would be considered sedition, anti-national, and so on and so forth. Or they have skeletons in their cupboard. And if the ED comes visiting, they'll be in trouble, the media organizations. Or the CBI comes visiting, they'll be in trouble. Or the income tax comes visiting, they are in trouble. So the market paradigm has actually altered the very schema of the media. The working journalist is non-entity today. There is no working journalist in the empowered sense of the term. There are no working journalist unions. Kerala is perhaps an exception. We still have a working journalist union here. They have all been defanged. There's no power for the working. It's all about media organizations, and editorial policies are determined by those who look at profit on the one hand and whether they are falling foul of those in power on the other hand. So how will you have an independent fourth pillar of democracy which can speak truth to power? You will only have a situation where the media has to make itself relevant by putting out what we think is news. And the media itself becomes the news. Of course, in the process, the credibility of the media is diminishing in slow but sure measure. In America, some years back, even in America, it's a bad seat. There's a Pew Research Center which does research on credibility of various organizations in society. They did a research of various organizations and forces in society. They said lawyer, journalist, doctor, academic, things like that. And they found that the media practitioner, journalists, they rated way down in the list. Only slightly better than second-hand car salesman. Because a second-hand car salesman will tell you any lie to sell your car. The media rated just one notch above that. This is not a fiction. This has actually happened. If you look up the Pew Research Center, and you Google it, you'll find this. So credibility of the media is a big issue. Yeah, there's a credibility issue and there's a credibility issue as far as consumers of the media, the public, civil society is concerned, and identity of crisis as far as the media itself is concerned. I do not know if the media practitioners know anymore why they are doing what they are doing. What is it that drives journalism? What is the passion? What is the commitment that drives journalism anymore? Is it to make a difference in society? Or is it to just grab eyeballs? Is it just to attract attention? It is the latter. It is this because as part of this market model of the media, you have what is called the tyranny of the ratings system. Ratings, the ratings mindset. Everything is rated. If I am running a television channel and I'm among 5 or 6 or 10 or 15 television channels, I need to do better than the other. Or I need to grab more eyeballs, as they say. I need to get more people to see me than the other. Only then the advertising will follow. Because my revenue model is based on my reach. On my reach, not in absolute terms, on my reach in a demographically important. For instance, if it's only in terms of reach, Doordarshan will still be the biggest act in town. No media in the country, even today, no other media has a bigger reach, a larger reach, either geographically or demographically, either in terms of population or in terms of physical reach, than Doordarshan. But Doordarshan doesn't get advertising like a much smaller media, any news media you take today, whose viewership will be 0.1% of the total TV universe. I'm not exaggerating, 0.1%, not even 1%. 0.1 or 0.2% of the total television viewing universe. They get far better advertising traction and support because all of that viewership has the purchasing power to buy the products which are advertised. And therefore, if I'm an advertiser wanting to sell a refrigerator or a car or a motorbike or any consumer durable, any expensive item, I cannot advertise it. There's no point in my advertising it on Doordarshan because 90% of my viewers don't have the money to buy my product. But I get 100% strike rate if I advertise it on 5 or 6 of these smaller channels. All of this may add up to 1%, 2%, 3% of the entire TV universe. So this is the economics that is at work. And when television became the big model, the dominant media, print media started tailing television. Of course, in India, we have no cross-media restrictions. So if I'm owning a newspaper, I can also own a channel, I can also own a portal, I can also own FM radio stations. On radio, there's no news possible, but I think they keep discussing matters, other things, on all FM radio stations. So there's no cross-media restriction. There's greater cartelization and monopoly and duopoly of that kind happening. So this is the way the market model affects the independence and the pluralism of the media as well. How does it affect the pluralism of the media? Okay, are you following the marketplace of ideas sample of the United States? Then there should be product differentiation. There should be product differentiation. There is a clear product differentiation, say, between PBS and CBS and CNN and Fox News in the United States. There's a clear distinction. In India, you don't have those distinctions either. Why? Because they're all finally giving you the same thing. This is simple. I mean, with a child's curiosity, if you switch channels on prime time on television, in any language, in English or Malayalam or Tamil or Telugu, you will find all the channels having the same news in the same order, more or less. You'll have the same guests appearing simultaneously on many channels while they are saying live. If they are live, I don't see how one person can be in 2 channels at the same time. You'll have exclusives, you'll have news breaks. News break has become a common phenomenon now. But you get the same standard news. You get the same headlines, you get the same arguments, you get the same spokesperson of party or of professional commentators, what you call the commentariat, who are standing by for television. Sometimes, unfortunately, comprising some academics who give credibility. They get only 20 seconds to speak, but they, what you call that, that a good historian is a good historian only another historian says is good, but here he tries to get endorsement because he's on media. So you have pulp historians, pulp psychologists, pulp scientists, whose argument, of course, is that what's wrong? I want to reach as many people as possible. You can reach as many people as possible if you are given the time to express what you want to say, not when you're cut off in mid-sentence, in 30 minutes, in 30 seconds or 45 seconds. That's an insult to the academia itself. So there's no pluralism either. Why is that so? Because the media works in a complicit club-like syndrome. If I'm the editor of a channel or a newspaper, and in an editorial meeting I say, we have missed this news, what does it mean? It doesn't mean that there are hundreds of billions of things happening in a world in a given day, right? How do you choose what is news out of that? These 5 or 6 or 10 items you can deal with. The only way you say, I missed the news is because a rival channel or another newspaper had that news and I did not. So already, you have circumscribed the idea of news. Already, you have sent the message implicitly to your reporter that if you don't come back with the news that others have, you will have missed the news and you'll have to pay for it. So the lesson for the news practitioner, for the news journalist is, if I must not miss the news, I must do what the other channel reporter or the other channel does. Which is why you find them like a herd, this herd mentality in the media. So this becomes a club syndrome. It's not as if somebody is sitting and plotting it, but this is the way it works. This is the way it happens. And it's imperative it happens like this because of the market forces, the market principle, the market compulsions of the media. This is what I call the market paradigm, the market model of the media. So the media then, the big question is, the media then becomes the news. Partly because if they want to say something new, they have to exaggerate that beyond a point. And then the question becomes whether the biryani was sent in a copper pot from a place to the chief minister's house, or whether there was gold biscuits buried in the biryani, or give insinuations to that effect, which in the normal course you would dismiss as ridiculous nonsense. But you keep saying it again and again and again, and even the most incredulous viewer or reader will begin to wonder, maybe there is something, there cannot be smoke without fire. That is a typical proto-fascist function of the media. Nietzsche, someone who understood fascism very well, famously said, the history of truth is the history of the longest lasting falsehood. The history of truth is the history of the longest lasting falsehood. In other words, you say a lie once, people will not believe. Twice, thrice, on the 7th or 10th or 100th time they will believe it. So media keeps at it. The big media, I don't have to mention names of the media who do this. And no media has the power, independent power, to go against it because the viewer thinks you have not done your job. They are saying something, you're saying something wrong. You're in a minority. There's a kind of majoritarianism acting on the media. You cannot be the only person who's right. Therefore, there must be something wrong with you. The others are all telling you the same thing. So there must be something right with that. So the media, which should have had the backbone, at least the backbone of a bourgeois press reader like Goenka, to speak truth to power and say, I will not bend, I will keep saying what I am saying, has capitulated before power. That is the identity crisis of the media. That is the lack of backbone in a good section of the media. There are honorable exceptions. I'm not speaking about the media as in one, but the exceptions are by definition exceptions. If the rule is what it is, then that's a terrible situation to be in. So this is the other problem, the ratings mindset. Because you need these ratings. As a result of that, you continue to do, each of you don't do anything different. And the fact that news has become so breathless, the idea of breaking news, 24/7, what's called 24/7 breaking news. I have given out a news bulletin at 9 o'clock. my next bulletin, nowadays there are no bulletins, there are only news hour discussions and debates and quarrel. But even if you assume there's a news, bulletin, there's a news. Let's say in India, you'll often find this one news. Boy falls into a tube well in some city or the other, normally in northern India. There'll be a news. The boy has fallen into a tube well. A small boy has tripped and fallen into a tube well. And the news will be around. So at 9 o'clock, I've said the news. People are all, houses are anxious about that. People at homes, family is concerned about it, tragedy of a family. So you follow it. You want to know what happened. At 10 o'clock, you turn it on again. Now, I cannot, as a news presenter or the news editor, say the same thing I said at 9 o'clock. Because the people will think you're not doing your job. You said this at 9 o'clock. But some other channel has given us some more information. What is that? They said, somebody thinks somebody heard the boy scratching the wall of the tube well. So maybe the boy is alive. All speculation. Nobody knows. They don't have a fire engine department person saying it. They don't have the collector or somebody saying it. They don't have the superintendent of police saying it. It's their imagination. And at 11 o'clock, this continues. You start flogging something, not to death, but to new life. You just keep doing bulletin after bulletin after bulletin. And therefore, you become the news. What you say becomes the news. So anchors become representative of something, of a position. In order to win the ratings game, the ratings game. The ratings mindset also does something terrible to our society. That's the other problem with the media. In this process of the news and the anchor becoming synonymous with the news, not so much concerned with what is happening in the news, it circumscribes our intellect itself. See, hardly 100 years back, the biggest achievements in science and technology and math and philosophy were achieved against the grain of the popular. Against the grain of the popular. When all the people thought the earth was flat, somebody came along and said the earth is spherical, is round. And the first few people, for several generations, for several decades, those who said it were burnt at the stake. It took the Copernican revolution and so on a long time to establish itself. But there were people who spoke against the grain of the popular because they were convinced, with good reason, with good deduction, with good scientific exploratory power. So you don't have that anymore. It's become very popular and populist. Being popular is good, but being populist means the least common denominator, the lowest common denominator in society. So the media has collapsed to that kind of a least common denominator phenomenon. And this problem of looking after itself, of projecting itself, becomes the issue. So the question that arises in the mind of an ordinary citizen is, if the media is only to be a product, if the media is only to be a function of the market, why should that media have constitutional protection? Why under Article 19(1)(a) and (g) should we speak about freedom of speech and expression, freedom to practice any profession? Why should the media cry foul and say we are in danger, democracy is in danger every time there is an attack on the media? I'm making a perverse argument, a kind of devil's advocate proper. Because if your argument is that you're only bothered about, there are media owners, very big media owners, I don't want to take names now, one of the biggest newspapers in the country, they have had this idea that they are not bothered about changing society. Their role is to have a successful media, a market media model. Then why do you cannot say you need constitutional protection to run a business in the market. You have the same right as a soap manufacturer. At least in a soap manufacturer's case, if a soap manufacturer makes soap which instead of cleaning your skin, scratches your skin, you can go to a consumer's court and file a case. Has anyone got to a consumer's court and filed a case against the media saying, for the last 10 years, I and my family have been watching this channel or reading this paper, and they have been giving us lies and spin and untruth and half-truths and misinformation and disinformation, therefore I'm suing them for $100,000 of 10 crore rupees? So this is the crisis of the constitutional crisis of the media. At the same time, media is very, very important. It's more important today than ever before. Because when democracy is in trouble, It is the media that has to speak truth to power, as I keep saying. But they're not doing it. They're not able to do it. They don't want to do it because many of them continue to laugh their way to the bank. The profit lines are wonderful. It's only when the profit lines are affected that you'll find the big owners of the media, the corporate owners of the media flocking together. It happened some time back, many years back. They formed an association called the Indian Media Association, and there was editorials in newspapers. They made a demand to the government saying that if you want to prevent foreign invasion into our media, there are restrictions, what you call FDI restrictions, foreign direct investment in the media is limited. You cannot have up to 25%. Sectorally, in each sector it's different. They said the only way to prevent foreign cultural invasion of our media is by creating a situation where you give privilege or prioritize media owners and their families in order to run, give them special powers and rights. In other words, to perpetuate their dynastic media. So these are the ways in which the media has been handling itself. And luckily, I'll just speak a little about what is the alternative, because it all looks like a very terrible and negative and dismal picture. Luckily, although it has both sides, the emergence of the social media has already challenged this media. The emergence of social media has its own problems, and those problems are not small. There's a lot of poison, there's a lot of misinformation, there's a lot of opinion, a lot of prejudice, bias, disinformation in that media. But it also affords the possibility of alternative views, of different views. You find criticisms of the media as well in that space. The problem with social media also is that political organizations, particularly like the BJP, who have a strong IT cell, they're able to manipulate that space very, very well. They have orchestrated. At one time, 100,000 people will tweet the same thing. It will almost look as if that is what has happened, because we are all watching. All of us, unfortunately, are subject of using smartphones and getting our news. Now, 85% of the news in the world, and India is no exception, India in the latest Reuters digital media study says 78%, get their news from the mobile phone, not from newspapers. Those of you who read newspapers, that includes me, are in a very bad minority. This is all from the phone, smartphone, that you get the news. The millennial generation. The millennial generation is the biggest demographic in our population, as you know. So this change becomes, so the social media is really the redemptive part, is where we can find redemption. Because there's a characterization of the social media as called the long tail. In the social media, in the digital social media, something called the long tail. In other words, you consider social media as an infinitesimal dark space, like terra incognita, like a huge but limitless space, dark space, undiscovered continent, metaphorically. Some people came there and put harsh lights on it. And those who had the harshest lights and the best lights began to get footfalls in that light. And they became the big digital media capitalists. And the digital media capitalists are capitalists of an unprecedented order. We have not had capitalism of that kind ever before. Their profits, net profits alone, are the equivalent of the GDPs of several countries in Africa and Latin America. And the big four in the media, say Apple, Google, Facebook, Amazon. These are the big four in the media. They are the ones who have the best lights in that space. That's called the head of the social media. So everyone flocks to that media. The algorithms and artificial intelligence determines what you will read. It determines what you get. They will push information to you. They realize that you like sports. How do they realize that? Because they've already harvested your information. Every time you use your credit card, every time you use your Aadhaar card, every time you travel on a flight and book online, they have already harvested information about you. What kind of profile you have. So they know. And so they are determining your appetite. They are not just giving you what you want. They determine your appetite by giving you these push notifications. And you then belong to that club in a WhatsApp group. These are the way these filter bubbles develop on the media, what you call echo chambers develop. And these prejudices also keep circulating and circulating. So in that social media, this head of the social media is what we are faced with, where all this poison and prejudice and algorithms operating in a self-perpetuating manner. are going on. But there's a long tail of the social media, and that is where the hope is. That is where the people's protests, people's movements, heterodox behavior, differences of opinion can emerge. And I believe social media is still a comparatively new phenomenon. After all, it's less than 10 years now, 10 or 15 years now. It's still in the infancy. And I have faith in the way the tail of the social media will develop. And I'm sure then a different model of the media will emerge. And what is that different model of the media? And here is something very paradoxical. This is my last point, and I'll stop. The different model of the media has been enunciated eloquently by no other than Karl Marx. This sounds paradoxical because you associate Soviet societies and communist regimes with suppression of media freedom, with exclusion of media from their governance, with saying that the media should only project what we want them to. That is a distortion of Marxism. That is a distortion of Marxism. And I think socialist societies, socialist governments, communist governments who have followed that pattern, even after the Russian Revolution, initially there was war communism, there was a need for, not criticizing. That was a temporary phase, but that temporary phase became permanent. They are responsible for, so we need to rediscover Marx the journalist. I said Gandhi was the biggest journalist in India. Marx was the biggest journalist of his century. He was the best journalist of his country, of his century. This was the earlier Marx, but in the 1852 to 1860, that period, he wrote about, he used to be the editor of the Rheinische Zeitung in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, in the Prussian state, and then the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, where he has written and spoken eloquently against censorship of the press, against suppression of the media. He has said censorship can never be legitimate even when it is a law, just as slavery can never be legitimate even when it is a law, because slavery was the law during his time. It was illegal to own slaves. He said censorship can never be legitimate even when it is a law, just as slavery can never be legitimate even when it is a law. He said the first freedom of the free press is not to be a business. That's the first freedom the press should exercise. And he had the idea of a folk press, folk as in VOLK, people's press. I mean, he has an entire blueprint for an alternative press. And I am rather dismayed and surprised that this is not something which even socialist governments or communist governments across the world have sought to tap into and put as a main agenda of governance. Because there is hope of the people reclaiming the media. There's hope of media becoming democratic again, the media becoming the fourth pillar of democracy again. The hope of media having a transformative power, making a difference to the lives of the people. So this, I think, is the essential problem of the media, because media, you must understand, has a totalizing influence on our lives. Media in the last century, media in the age of the Industrial Revolution did not have that role. It was a sector of our lives. Now it has a totalizing influence on our lives. We breathe. We must speak in terms of a media ecology. Just like you speak about, sustainable growth and development, threats to ecology and environment. We must speak in terms of a media ecology because you breathe the media. You live the media, whether you like it or not. It's an intrinsic part of all our lives, because its representative function has become so overwhelming and so totalizing. Because of the modern day speed of our lives, because of the way information revolution has overtaken our lives, we have lost the habit of discovering truth for ourselves. We need the media to tell us the truth because we have lost faith in our capacity to distinguish the truth. A.K. Ramanujan summed this up beautifully at one point. He said, in the Indian system, there are 4 modes of cognition. Pratyaksha, that which is obvious, which is very patent. Anumana, that which is deduced or inferred. Aptavakya, the account of somebody who was present, maybe like the Mahabharata, somebody is seeing it and relating it to the king. Smriti. Smriti is the binding factor, memory. We are here in a Smriti occasion. It's a remembrance, it's also a memory, the cement of memory. And he says, The problem with representative reality, what we have is representative reality as against real reality, is that you get used to being represented too, that you lose the capacity of understanding pratyaksha. If you see something obviously before you, you don't know if it's true. Why? Because it doesn't come on television, it doesn't come in the newspaper. It can't be true unless it comes in the media. We have got habituated, we have become habituated representative, we have been habituated to being represented. And Ramanujan cites a beautiful example of, in Abhijnana Shakuntalam, of Kalidasa's Abhijnana Shakuntalam, of Dushyanta, where he loses his memory after meeting this Shakuntala, and he goes to his palace and forgets about her. But he has flashes of memory, and he recounts, I'm paraphrasing it, he says, like the elephant who walks before me and I cannot recognize it, but after the elephant has left, I see the footprints and say, these are the footprints of an elephant, and therefore that which passed before me must be an elephant. My incapacity to recognize the pratyaksha, the elephant in the room, I will not be able to recognize. But after the elephant has left, I see the footprints and use my deductive powers and say that must be an elephant. So that representative element is what the media is, becoming totalizing in the media, is what is totalizing in our lives. Aptavakya is also part of the media. Reporter is a function of a reporter. Reporter goes and reports to you. What happened here? What happened in this? There was a police lathi charge, or this, he said this, or this minister said this in a conference. So these are the ways in which we are become victims of the media. These are the ways in which McLuhan famously said the medium is the message, where the media have themselves become the news. That is the short point I'm making. I know there's a lot there, but I would think that there should be more interrogation and thinking and discussion on the media, not with a view to rubbish the media or wish it away, because without media, unfortunately, is the only redeeming factor as well. It is the biggest problem before our lives, and it is the only potential solution before our lives. How do we then reclaim the media? How do people reclaim the media that affects their lives so vitally, so importantly, and so crucially? That, I think, is the essential challenge before us, and I'm happy that on this occasion of remembering Murali Masha, I was able to share these thoughts and ideas with you. Thank you very much.
ആർക്കെങ്കിലും ഈ സ്മാരക പ്രഭാഷണത്തിൽ ആക്ഷേപത്തോടെ ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ചോദിക്കാനുണ്ടെങ്കിൽ അവസരമുണ്ട്. ചോദ്യങ്ങൾ ഒരു മൈക്കും കൂടെ കൊടുത്തോളൂ പ്ലീസ്.
That the media should be impartial to a great extent, but the thing is that the paymasters are making the media men at their own disposal. And would you like to explain that thing, sir?
Yeah, I think the question was, you were saying that media should be impartial, but the paymasters, those who are running the media, are setting their own agenda, which is true. There's agenda setting in the media. Agenda setting in the media should be media can build agendas. Media should build agendas. I mean, if there is justice, injustice, media cannot be objective, purely neutral and objective. If there's an oppressor and an oppressed, you cannot say, I'm the media, so I'll give equal time to the oppressor and the oppressed. That's ridiculous. The media should take a stand. Media should be on, as I said, those who are the weaker, those who need protection, those who are being ridden roughshod over. But the problem is in the market model. In the market model, this is natural, that the owners, the proprietors, they will determine the editorial. There was a time when editorial and marketing was a sacred division in the media. You know that in the Times of India office in Bombay, there are 2 lifts. In one lift, only the editorial people can go. In the other lift, only the marketing people can go. In fact, if a marketing people goes to the editorial lift, it was scandalous, because it was seen as trying to influence editorial. That's how clear the division was. But now, that's not there, not in that paper, not in any other paper. Marketing decides what is the news, because based on that, they can sell advertising. That is because of the market model. That's why I said, when I think back, 1991-92, liberalization, globalization, our entire media propelled into the entire market model. Then naturally all the role of proprietorship, corporate, corruption, corporate corruption, not just in financial terms, but also in mind, creeping.
Hello, sir. Thank you very much for enlightening us on the status of the present media situation, especially in the Indian continent. In this context, I just wanted to get a feedback from your side. See, on one side, Indian civilization is claimed to be on the top of the world with a lot of supporting evidences and all whatnot. If you compare, you yourself, you examine your career, what is the value that is being given by the media in their work? Many teachers were explaining here the role of a teacher and what that value element, how has it traveled from now we are going to the 75th year of the independence. What is the prime cause for the unexplicable deterioration of the value in the whole country? Has it got any relation with the value we claim on our civilization of 5,000 and odd years? What is called Indian civilization, so-called? How do you compare it? And if there is any solution we are looking at, if there is any light at the end of the tunnel happening? This is my question. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. I may have a slight different view on this than what you have. I don't believe in India as a glorious civilization being celebrated beyond a point. That is the beginning of a fascistic understanding. Civilizational glory is there in all civilizations. Every civilization in the world will claim that it's not a glorious civilization. Ours may be a much older civilization, but then we do not know whether that is this civilization, right? Because that will get us into the issue of which civilization, which is, is it Mohenjo-daro, is it Harappa, is it the subsequent kingdoms, is it the Mughal interregnum, is it the British interregnum, is it post-independence? So we are a nation which has, it's like several layers of civilization, and to homogenize it as one civilization, I think it's good for rhetoric, it's good for feeling pride in our heritage, but I think it is also dangerous because behind that is a search for cultural purity, for cultural superiority, for cultural hegemony, and that is precisely what is happening now. This whole reverting to saying that we were conducting surgery in the Vedic ages, that we were doing this and we were doing that. So that part of it, in other words, I think the media becomes democratic when it is less culturally pure. In Victorian England, in television, they would never show a lady. They would never show a black man. They would never show a man chewing gum, this. When that started creeping in, that's when society at large started watching those programs. Until then, only a few people would watch it. If you look at Indian television, history of Indian television, in particular in Tamil Nadu where I am, I was in Doordarshan at a time, the early serials on television will all be about Brahmins and Brahminic themes. Whereas the preponderance of the people who are watching you are not Brahmins, they are a small sliver of society. And when initially those things came in after the Dravidian movement, and so, even then it took a long time to explode that. So this kind of purism that leads to saying that there's only one Ramayana, and anybody says any other Ramayana becomes, it becomes almost like apostate or becomes blasphemy. When Ramanujam says there are 300 Ramayanas, or R.K. Narayanan writes there are 300 Ramayanas, the entire machinery of the government and of the BJP government will bear down on him. Whereas the fascination of the Ramayana is that it is such a wonderful national epic which has different interpretations, different applications, different relevance to different parts of our life in our country and countries in Southeast Asia. So that is the problem with looking for this whole golden civilization idea. I think which is why America is better off, because they were a civilization which began on a clean slate. Of course, they massacred a lot of Red Indians. That genocide nobody writes about. That's the unwritten history of the United States. How they killed millions or thousands, tens of thousands of Red Indians, the original inhabitants there. But they don't have a glorious civilization to speak about, right? Because it starts on a clean slate at one point. from the Pilgrim Fathers who went to settle there and the 13 colony, all that we know in history. So this is the role of the media is not to perpetuate myths. The role of the media, media is only the first draft of history. It's been called that. Media, the role of the news media is the first draft of history. Because in the media you will get to know what are the trends, what are the way, what is the way things are moving. It's a historian who has to write decisively and authoritatively with rigor, academic rigor and research about it. So the media should never try to become what a scholastic historian can be, and the media has to be tentative in its findings. The media must be modest. The media cannot be arrogant. There was an editor of a leading newspaper in this country who at one time said, this was in the 80s before the media came to this pathetic state, because with the role of finance capitalism, media has become very pathetic. He said, I am the second most important person in this country. Some of you may know. This was Dilip Padgaonkar of the Times of India. And he was right. At that time, he was very powerful. He said, after the Prime Minister, I am the most important person in this country. He said this in a public meeting. And it was reported, initially people thought he's talking arrogantly. It was arrogance, but it was also true. But that media has collapsed now. Prabhat Patnaik, who once gave a speech at the Asian College of Journalism, said, the media in the age of finance capitalism is like the dog which walks under the bullock cart, on the shade of the bullock cart. It's an Oriya saying apparently, he's translating it. A dog which walks under the shade of the the dog thinks it is driving the bullock cart forward. So the role of the media, says, is a bit like that. They think they are in charge, but they are nowhere in charge. And they are in an enviable situation now because those in power don't care for the media. Prime Minister Modi has not given a single press conference. He doesn't care. He doesn't need to. Why? Because he has Twitter, he has Tweet, he has Facebook, he has Man Ki Baat. He can speak to his constituency. He doesn't need the media. The media has become redundant and superfluous as far as he is concerned. Trump did the same thing. He discontinued the press briefings in the White House, as you know. He said, I don't care, because these are all people who give fake news anyway. He was himself the master of fake news. For his inaugural ceremony, he said 1.6 million people came in the White House, in the congressional building. Whereas there were 100,000 cameras there from all over the world. It was not more than 100,000 people there. But he continues to say that even today. He says that's all fake news. This repeat the truth 100 times. This is called post-truth actually. This is the idea of post-truth. You invert the truth into its opposite and it becomes post-truth, So you can't argue with post-truth. You can argue with truth, with logic and reasoning and so on. Yes? Did you want to say? Oh no, did someone want to say something? Sorry. Okay, thank you.